So now I'd like to introduce our final panel of the day. And I will introduce our moderator, Vivek Viswanathan, who's a policy fellow here at SIEPR. He previously served in the White House as a senior policy advisor and special assistant to the president between 2021 and 2024, working on the National Economic Council and in the Chief of Staff's office. Before that, he worked as a special advisor in the office of Governor Jerry Brown and as deputy budget director and senior counselor to Governor Gavin Newsom. Vivek loves history and claims the distinction of visiting all 13 of the presidential libraries operated by the National Archives, from the George W. Bush Museum in Texas to the Herbert Hoover Museum in West Branch, Iowa, which happens to be a 15-minute drive from where I grew up. So with that, Vivek, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Ramin, for that introduction, and welcome to the final panel for this afternoon, final panel discussion, which is on designing public policy for an AI future. And I think, as James Monica mentioned in the last panel, we all know that this technology is moving very fast, and policymakers have to move fast as well if they want to keep up. And the good news is that, at least right now, AI policy is not a policy that is polarized in a partisan way in Washington, D.C., unlike almost every other policy issue. The bad news is that when it comes to AI policy, the picture of what needs to get done and what will get done 1 year from now, 2 years from now, is still very unclear. And I think when you look at the last couple of years, we had former President Biden's AI executive order that was more than 2 years ago. We had the Senate bipartisan working group on AI put out their report that was more than 1.5 years ago. We had the House bipartisan task force report on AI that was more than a year ago. And then President Trump's AI action plan that was now over 4 months ago. And yet we still have a sense of we don't quite know where this is going, and there's a lot of uncertainty with far more questions than answers, and a lot of the policy discussion now actually happening both at the individual state level and then also at the international level. And so what we want to do at a time when policymakers have a lot of big decisions to make, they need good analysis and good advice, is talk about some of those issues and where we want to go forward from here. And luckily, we have an incredible panel here to help us do that. And so immediately to my left is Susan Athey, who is a professor of economics here at Stanford and one of the foremost experts in the world when it comes to the intersection of economics and technology. In addition to the many other things that she has done, including having served as consulting chief economist at Microsoft, she most recently completed a term of public service as the chief economist in the antitrust division of the U.S. Department of Justice. Second, right next to Susan, is Dabla-Norris, who's deputy director at the International Monetary Fund, helping to oversee their entire fiscal affairs department across all countries, has an incredible amount of experience when it comes to fiscal issues and imbalances across countries, and also has worked on a range of issues from labor to technology to productivity. And then finally, furthest to my left is Sam Hammond, who is chief economist at the Foundation for American Innovation, which has the mission of championing the technology, talent, and ideas essential to American prosperity and security and flourishing. His analyses on AI and emerging technology are widely read in the AI and technology policy community, including among policymakers in the Trump administration in the White House. And so what I've asked our panelists here to do is to start off by talking about an issue that they think is especially important when it comes to where AI policy is going and that they've spent some time on. And so, Susan, I want to start with you, and I was hoping you could talk about some of the choices that countries face as they interact with and participate with the emerging AI economy.
Yeah, so I think at this point, I think I've been sitting in like 2 conferences a week on AI for like many, many years. And so I'm actually going to try to actually talk about something that not everybody is talking about and that is not in every one of my conferences. So right now, one of the impetus for this policy is that I'm an advisor to the World Bank right now, and we're looking at developing policy advice for the developing world, but actually this insight's broader too. When you talk to a lot of policymakers about AI and AI adoption, they often frame it as if it's like something that you adopt, like you adopt bed nets, or you adopt, maybe people are going to adopt vaccines, but it's, or maybe, some kind of, scrubber on a power plant. It's like a thing that you adopt. While AI is very different, it's a technology that creates many, many products. It's also a general purpose technology that makes software development much cheaper, and it changes the cost of changing software. So it kind of powers the innovation process. So with that as a backdrop, if I think about, how are countries sort of participating in AI, the question is really, how are they going to participate in the development of AI products or the purchase and use of those AI products? But because AI products are generally not fixed things, but rather things that are going to be incrementally improved, it's actually how are they going to participate in, even as a user of a product, in the improvement of those products. And so as I go to the developing world, the government will actually be a fairly major consumer of AI products and a purchaser of AI products, even relative to the private sector. So let's think about all the things that the government does. The government is involved in teachers, it's involved in healthcare, it's got a hand in the financial sector, and of course it's got the defense sector, which might be larger or smaller, depending on the country. So the governments are actually going to be in the business of procuring AI services, either directly or indirectly. And so how are they going to do that? Are they going to do that well, or are they going to do that badly, or not at all? So when you go to a technology conference, you're going to see all of these great products. And so, products that help people, that help nurses, and I've built some of these products myself, products that help teachers. There's lots and lots of products that look fantastic. But if we think about, what if we had a room full of like 1,000, medical applications, all of which were AI-based and all of which were beneficial? What would you actually do if you were the Minister of Health in the country? Like, should you adopt one now? Should you wait till next year? How many should you adopt? If you're going to adopt something for nurses, probably the nurses you can only logistically get one nurse application in a year, or maybe in a 2-year period. So how are you actually going to do that? And then if anybody's actually worked in a company, you remember that IT adoption is hard and often fails for big Fortune 100 companies. When governments do procurement, it goes okay. And this is less like regular government procurement. This is more like defense procurement, in the sense that you're going to if you have someone come in and build an AI product for your nurses in your country, you're actually going to need that product to be improving year on year. You're going to be collecting data and doing incremental innovation around that product, so that you don't choose by the best demo, but you're going to need to choose a partner who is going to be able to gather the data and be incentivized to continually improve your product. That actually sounds kind of hard. Okay, but that is actually what the world is going to be doing, from Fortune 100 down to some Ministry of Health in a very small, poor country. Everybody's going to be thinking about this same kind of problem. And so this is actually a capacity issue. It's a technical capability issue, but it's one where there's a lot at stake and it's pretty hard. But on the other hand, policymakers can collaborate globally to share best practices, to learn about what works well, to collaborate on how to evaluate these products and how to assess them on both at purchase, but also on an ongoing basis. So this is an opportunity I see. So many problems we have are intractable, but this is actually a problem that's sort of solvable with effort and investment and expertise. So that's my pitch for something that people aren't talking about that I wish they were.
Very helpful. Thank you, Susan. And on that point of what governments can do, there is the technical challenge of how do we make the right decisions and set the right decision process around this. There's also the broader question of what resources will these governments actually have to bear to attack those problems in the first place. And Ira, I was hoping you can talk about that. You focus a lot on fiscal policy and especially emerging fiscal balances that we see across countries. And so tell us what you're seeing, both in terms of cause and effect with AI, in terms of the effect on the fiscal policies and picture for these countries.
Okay, thanks, Vivek. So I'm going to start where I guess Eric started. And that is, there's a lot of uncertainty about how this technology is going to have an impact on societies. How large are the productivity gains? How large are the growth benefits? But I think the important question really is, are governments prepared to manage both the business as usual, sort of benign scenarios, or the really disruptive, painful scenarios that we've spoken about, various panels today have spoken about. So I'm going to talk about two policy challenges that I see being crucial. And both of these have been raised to varying degrees, but I'm just going to expand on them. The first is whether social protection systems are fit for purpose. And by social protection systems, I mean unemployment, insurance, labor market, training policies, social assistance programs for the poor. Are they fit for purpose in a world of AI? Right? So when we think about the main benefits that this technology could bring, well, productivity could be huge, new jobs could potentially be created, wages could, in the end, be higher economy-wide because of the large productivity gains. There's also a risk, and the risk is really painful labor market disruptions. So you need some kind of income support, you need training policies, but the truth is that worldwide, countries are not prepared. So let me just give you some numbers. Only 17% of unemployed workers around the world receive any kind of cash benefits. And there are stark disparities. 56% in high-income countries, 0.2% in low-income. Even in high-income countries, these unemployment benefits. So imagine a very painful, prolonged labor market transition. So these entry-level workers that we talked about don't get a job for a very, very long time. It takes a long time for them to apprentice as plumbers. Say that's the switch that we're looking at. Well, even in advanced economies, most of these unemployment benefits are really segmented along occupational lines. Benefits are not portable. New labor market entrants don't get any, and they're capped, 12 months. So imagine a really painful transition where people are out of a job over a longer period of time. Now turn to lower income, advanced, emerging market and low income countries. What happens there? Well, they don't have any social protection systems. And they don't have anything to provide a cushion if there is displacement. So the cost of these transitions and who will bear them becomes a really important question. We've already talked about the training piece of it. Training typically tends to not keep pace with fast technological changes. So the question again is, who shall pay for these types of changes? And many of these problems are actually magnified in poorer countries because you have a large informal sector. You have a lot of people a lot of young people who are not working, nor are they studying. So the social impacts are much, much harder to bear. And while we've talked about the benefits that AI could itself bring, there is really a question of how are countries going to be able to deploy it when they have limited fiscal space. So I think this is the question of adoption that you referred to is also one of how are you going to pay for it? So let me just briefly touch upon the issue of UBI. This is something that Silicon Valley likes to refer to as sort of the solution to the problem of labor market displacement. Well, this is fiscally very, very costly. Just to give you an idea, if you were to set benefits at 40% of median income per capita, which is not huge, I mean just 40% of median income per capita, the cost would be 14% of GDP in an average advanced economy, up to 20% in Poland. Okay? And so if you start thinking about moving up higher than 40% median income per capita, the cost could be fiscally very, very large. And then this raises the question, who's going to pay for it? So that's the first challenge. Very quickly, I want to talk about the second challenge. And this is something that Eric and others have also referred to, which is it's not inevitable that we need to have massive displacement or automation. This is a policy choice. And I think one of the areas that we could look at is how our tax systems are creating incentives for automating people over workers. Now, I'm not talking about a robot tax or some sort of a special tax on AI, which is also being bandied about and sort of out there. A lot of people will say, well, if you tax AI, that's going to slow down, or if you have some sort of a special tax, an agent or an algorithm or a chatbot can pay a tax. I mean, only legal entities can. And even if you could have a tax, not clear what the tax base would be. I mean, instead, countries, what they could do is they could look at existing tax incentives that they have. Are their tax systems disproportionately encouraging automation over people by providing tax credits, incentives, all of these kinds of things? In fact, our research, we found that the marginal effective tax rates on software, hardware that can potentially replace labor tend to be much lower than those on those types of assets that complement workers. So rebalancing this kind of imbalance in existing tax systems to prevent this kind of disproportionate incentives that are created for innovation could be a useful step. And this is something that countries can do now. They don't have to wait for 5 years down the line. This is something that can be done now. So let me stop here.
Very helpful. Thank you, Ira. And so Susan and Ira, you've both talked about some of the key dynamics we're seeing across countries. I want to shift just for a moment to the United States. So Sam, you've written a lot about President Trump's AI action plan, and comments on that plan have been all over the map. Some people say they've rescinded former President Biden's EO and put out what was basically a similar set of policies. On the other hand, you see people who say this has basically lifted all the restraints and it's a let-it-rip type of policy. You've seen criticism, maybe this is so focused on woke AI and not focused on the broader contours. You, of course, had a much more positive view of what the administration did. You called it a giant leap forward. And so I was hoping I could ask you about how you think the U.S. is positioned in this moment coming out of that set of plans this summer.
Yeah, sure. I mean, full disclosure, my bias, my colleague Dean Ball helped draft the action plan. So I'm predisposed to liking it. But I think a lot of the, if you actually dig into the plan, and I would disagree slightly that the reaction to it was actually pretty uniformly positive, including among many congressional Democrats. People within the AI safety community came out very positive on it. The plan contains multiple parts. There's a huge emphasis on building AI infrastructure and energy infrastructure, accelerating permitting, which is going to be a massive bottleneck. A big component of this is also pushing AI into government. So, if I had any one complaint with the Biden executive order on this count was the amount of layers, additional process it put in place for approving the use of AI tools within government. This government's taking very much the opposite approach, where these chief AI officers that are going to be in every agency are, instead of asked to be a gatekeeper for new AI tools, are essentially going to be asked for what did you automate lately, and sort of flipping that burden of proof on its head. And then there's even components in there on biosecurity. There's a whole section on gene synthesis screening, which if AI continues to accelerate in biology, one of the core risks that we face is the development of homegrown biothreats. And if you want to, you can't, it's hard enough to control the model, but one thing you can do is control access to the DNA synthesis companies that can actually print that out into a viable organism. So, big picture, I think this administration is making AI one of its top maybe 3 priorities. You've seen this both through the investment deals that have been brokered, the broader emphasis on energy infrastructure, the ways in which they're approaching this in a full stack kind of way. To I think a point Susan made about it's not just that you can adopt AI. If we have a massive explosion in drug discovery, it's not going to be enough to just give FDA officials AI co-pilots. We're going to need to think about fundamental process innovation. And that's true of the broader regulatory state. There's so much regulation that it's not so much too much or excess regulation. It's that it lacks a certain direction of fit with a post-AI world, right? We have rules that state that you have to have, human operators of a crane that were written not because they didn't want to foreclose the possibility of an autonomous crane, but because they didn't think the technology existed. And so, big component of the action plan has been a comprehensive regulatory review to look at essentially every part of the Code of Federal Regulations that implicates or is incompatible with the post-AI world. Bigger picture, I think there's still a lot of work to be done. I mean, one of the big fights going on right now is, should we let the states have much more say in AI governance, or do we have a federal preemption? I have a sort of more nuanced position on that. There's also debates within the conservative movement. I come from the right, but on the right, people are not uniformly, gung-ho about AI. There's certainly the sort of venture capitalist faction that is all in, and then you also have many social conservatives, religious conservatives that are concerned about what it means for human dignity, for the safety of children, particularly when it comes to bio. These debates around transhumanism, posthumanism, and so it's really an exciting time to be in Washington. In fact, sometimes it's kind of surreal because all these internet debates that I grew up engaging in are now literally playing out through coalitions within Washington. You have the accelerationists and the AI doomers, and you have the weird futurists that want to upload their brains, and they're actually drafting. We call it the posting the policy pipeline. There's been a number of executive orders that have actually originated on Twitter from some of these debates, and so one meta point is that I just think it's a very dynamic moment, and one of the things I value about this administration is how it's been open to that dynamism.
Very helpful. And I think one thing we've heard often from the administration is they want America to win on AI. And of course, that can mean different things to different people, but it is clearly a driver of the policy. And on that question, I want to bring it back to Susan, because one of the most important questions that we're thinking about right now, all of us as policymakers, is antitrust. And on the one hand, we have, for the last couple of years, people wondered, is there space for new entrants? And now you have these companies like OpenAI and Anthropic and Databricks that within a couple of years have gone to valuations of several $100 billion. On the other hand, the biggest companies have gotten much bigger just within the last decade. I imagine, Susan, when you were consulting with Microsoft, a big tech company might be defined as a couple $100 billion. Now we're seeing these big tech companies at $3 or $4 or even $5 trillion. And so you served at DOJ when everything was evolving very quickly. Curious if you have an answer for this crowd on what the antitrust policy should be going forward and how worried versus excited we should be about the incredible growth in the scale of these companies.
How long do you have? So I could talk about this for a couple of hours, but let me try to hit a few highlights. First, I actually just wanted to pick up on the Biden administration policy about AI and sort of thinking about what governments do that affects competition. So one of my jobs at the Antitrust Division was to comment on all of these other rulemakings and policies, not just in the US, but all over the world. People would send us stuff to give comments on. And my red line was very much of a broken record of every one of these policies, and consider how it's going to affect competition. And if you're a small country, you might end up not having very many suppliers in your country if there's something that you do that scares those suppliers away. And then you might not, if you have only one, then you don't have a lot of leverage to get them to follow your policies, and they start pushing back. So, it's effective policy in the long run requires competition, because powerful companies can threaten governments. Governments can also threaten powerful companies, and things can happen. Okay, we have lots of examples of that. So the second point around this is that am I worried? Well, I think just like you mentioned, that things can be really bad if a lot of people get laid off. You might not think it's super likely. A lot of the developing world jobs are not that AI exposed, but if it does happen, it's really bad. And I think of the same with competition. If we have a lot of market power in the AI stack anywhere, it is really, really bad. So if you think about especially almost every country is a small country when it comes to AI. And so if you are not the United States kind of country, or not China kind of country, then you are going to be importing this thing from somewhere else. And so if you're importing something at a high price and it's displacing your workers, then you will displace your workers, but your consumers will still pay high prices for goods. Okay, so most of the macro models just assume that when costs fall, that prices fall with them, and that's how we all end up on the beach. with a daiquiri. Okay, but like to get there, you know, the prices have to reflect costs. And I think the kinds of cost structures, cost savings, pricing structures, you know, not linear prices that we're going to see in all this, I think it's definitely not, we should not presume that cost savings, especially in terms of automated out workers, will reflect themselves in lower prices for consumers. So I am worried. I'm very worried. Okay, last point, and this is really like where I could spend a couple of hours, is why actually I don't think that we're going to immediately have a monopoly. So I have long answers and short answers. I have like 10 actually like overlaying reasons why I believe that. But so I think we need to be careful. Like it's risky and it's dangerous. But why do I think it's not going to happen immediately? Well, do we think there's going to be a global monopoly in fighter jets? Why not? Okay. Well, like this is not just like ChatGPT in a browser window. This is like a product that is sold to the defense industry. And it's like a critical input for the defense industry, and not just like for like drones, but also for surveillance. So like, no, you're not going to buy that from your military adversary. And if you're a little bit worried that someone else might turn off the switch on something that's a critical input to your military, you start looking for multiple sources. So I think there is just like, it's not really an option for the world to have one company do this. And in the military, you know, you buy low quality things at high cost all the time. So like if you say somebody else's thing isn't going to be as good, like that's not an answer. And then if your use case isn't like chit-chatting in a window, then getting lots of data about chit-chatting in a window doesn't actually help you be better at like some of these other use cases. So, and then there's the rest of the enterprise use cases who are also going to be procuring things. They want things lightweight. They want things, you know, James was just talking about all the different ranges of products that Google offers. But like when there are lots and lots of differentiated products, you often end up with lots of different companies selling it. Finally, there's open models, which like once you download, you have them forever. So, you know, there's that, and you can fine tune them and make them better. So I'm actually like not that worried in the medium term about like a monopoly, a single monopoly. People then tell me, well, Susan, how can you be right? Why are all these people investing so much? And how can the prices be what they are? You must be wrong. Okay. Like, you know, we can play some bets on that.
And just one
It's a good time to bet. It's a good time to place bets.
One follow-up, just to flip the question, and Sam, I'd like you to weigh in on this also. You often hear in these policy discussions, could there be a room for a national champion approach from governments? We had the CFO of OpenAI a week or two ago talk about the possibility of a government backstop. She later clarified her comments, but I'm curious if you think, and Sam, you should weigh in as well, if that's a way you could see things possibly unfolding depending on how the technology evolves.
All right, there's a bunch of people in the room who are better at this than me, but I guess like sort of like was said in the last panel, like okay, at some level, at some point, if the wrong people are the ones holding this equity, then bad things will happen elsewhere. But like if some of the people who invested in these valuations lose, you know, that's kind of sad, but like capitalism works that way. And so I don't like, it's not entirely clear why you need to bail them out to me, but someone else might have a better idea of that. Like it's not like there's not a commercial concern here. And so I guess there's but I do think that countries other than the United States may rationally decide to have another source of this technology, because it's not just the military. Imagine you're thinking about using AI in your payment system, you know, in your credit card systems and everything else. Like it's, you really, okay, maybe you can make out a commercial arrangement where the servers are in your country and the data centers are in your country and the data isn't leaving. But like if somebody somewhere else has a kill switch for your economy, like that's kind of bad. So I think that there's going to be rational reasons that are not economic reasons to do that.
And that's the whole industrial policy debate. I'm sorry to jump in. This is, and you're seeing this whole debate play out in Europe. You're seeing this, you know, I mean, China has a state-led model, so that's a different model. But there are many, many countries that are saying, okay, well, where along the spectrum do we want to have economic security or national security or what have you, many other reasons. And so this is very much intrinsically a part of the industrial policy debate. It used to be just purely energy security. In the last 3 years, we're seeing this morph into, well, we need our own, we can't compete with these AI companies, but if you look at the data center build-outs in Europe, if you look at it in other parts of the world, you're seeing this, that we need our own way of handling this technology or using this technology, and we don't want to be dependent on the Magnificent Seven for everything. So I think there is very much that kind of a mindset in other countries as well.
Right, and then the policy question, which I don't claim to know the answer to, is, well, exactly who should do what? And is it too much data centers? But like the data centers is just isn't about jumpstarting the local economy. It's like it gives you leverage for pricing, and it gives you security. It's like everybody has their own financial rails, and so on. But not every country makes fighter jets. So like
there is such a thing as comparative advantage. I mean, economists know this.
But also not one country makes fighter jets. So that's going to be the thing. That's the equilibrium. Like what's going to be the equilibrium in the world, and what coalitions will form, and who's going to trust whom. That's going to be. But this is going to be like a big geopolitical thing. But it's analyzing it purely from economics. I think misses some key points.
Great, and I think it was a Stanford economist who more than 3 decades ago said, "Computer chips, potato chips. What's the difference?" But clearly, we're in a different era right now. But I would like you, Sam, to weigh in on this question, and more broadly, you have written strongly in favor of strong export controls on the export of advanced semiconductor chips to China. We know you talked about divides within the White House coalition, and there are folks within the White House who strongly favor free exports to China of these chips as a way of cementing American leadership. NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang has said America's biggest weapon in the AI race is President Trump, as a way for him to try to push the direction of let's make sure our stack is used everywhere. So I was curious if you could weigh in on these questions.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the monopoly question, I think there's this, whether AI becomes monopolized, it really depends on like your timelines. We just heard that AGI is 5 to 10 years away. I tend to lean towards the shorter end of that spectrum. So we're not talking about chatbots here. We're talking about things that in the very near term will essentially be able to do anything you can do behind a laptop, and very shortly after that, in a robotic form, be able to do virtually anything. And you get very powerful feedback loops when we start crossing those inflection points. So we've seen this in micro with Google sort of hoovering up everyone's ad revenue, or Amazon hoovering up everyone's book sales. And if you build the everything company, and it's not just the everything company for like today's markets, it's also the AI researcher that builds its successor, then you can get very powerful flywheel effects that could pull ahead. So, but this is also is fractal. It's both like within the competition between companies in the United States and domestically, but also geopolitically, right? We might worry about one company in the US becoming dominant and becoming monopolized, but if we don't compete, that also means that we could be in for a century of Chinese hegemony. So this goes back to the export control discussion, which, it kind of boggles my mind how anyone could think that selling China the chips to compete is actually going to help our competitive advantage. As it stands today, we have about depending on how you count it, like a 30x compute edge over China, thanks to NVIDIA, because we have a massive market dominance in the leading edge AI chips. China is trying to catch up, but they're export controlled on advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment and the chips themselves. And so even Huawei and SMIC and these Chinese national champions trying their best, they are many years behind us, but for these export controls. And so this, again, goes back to this point of, like, is AI just a normal technology? Is it like the internet? Is it just more chatbots? Or are these systems that within a very near term going to be powering, not just autonomous, workers and call center workers and things like that, but also autonomous R&D, autonomous weaponry, offensive cyber operations? We should not be selling our core adversary the technology, the ammunition to then use against us. And moreover, the demand for this compute is going to be so infinite that we really don't gain that much by selling them the chips in the first place. That does then circle around to the international context, and to I think Susan's point, if we have half the economy flowing through a data center, you don't want that to be outside your borders, because that's just a total abdication of your sovereignty. and developing countries are going to feel the same way, we'd rather that be on the US tech stack than the Chinese tech stack, in part because I think, AI is going to be incredibly disruptive. It's going to be especially disruptive in weaker states, and there's going to be a huge demand for social order and some technologies to restore, to combat civil unrest. And a lot of the Chinese tech stack was developed in response to the Arab Spring. They saw how, a mirror information technology like Facebook could lead to regime change. So if Facebook could do that, what do you think AGI is going to do, right? And so, they're building a kind of autocracy as a service, where if you're a middle country and you need to have your surveillance, you need to have, predictive policing, these AI-enabled technologies, there's going to be a buyer's market, and we'd rather sell that technology with American values, values around privacy, civil liberties, and respect for human rights. And that depends on us sort of getting there first. And so, going back to the opening point, this becomes a kind of double bind because there's going to be other problems that are created by that. There's going to be massive potential power concentration. We need to figure out how to balance those two things.
Makes sense. And Ira, I want to turn to you because we've been talking a lot what happens if AI continues to progress very quickly and the pace of change accelerates even further. But there's also the chance of some type of crash. And Mohammed in the last panel said more likely than not that we're in some type of bubble. And so in your work across countries, you've seen a lot of commodity-related boom and bust cycles. You've talked a little bit about how we're not necessarily prepared in terms of our social insurance. I was wondering, none of us can predict the future, but in terms of what the United States in particular should be ready for, what are some of the things that you'd like to see that you think would make it easier to navigate all of this?
Yeah, no, I think Mohammed was right. I mean, when you look at valuations here in the U.S., they're really stretched. Growth is increasingly concentrated in the AI sector. Investment is more than half of business investment in the U.S. currently is really coming from the AI sector. And so there's questions about, is it overbuilt? Are we going to be in the 21st century version of, stranded assets, of overbuilt of AI infrastructure? There's a question of, these asset type of booms leading to not necessarily translating into real productivity gains or real sustainable demand, and then you see reversals. I mean, we see this in commodity booms. You see the bust phase. And one of the things that we see across countries is that in past booms, they're always preceded by asset bubbles and by leverage. And there's two things here that are of concern, I think, to me, that worry me in this current context. The first is that valuations are stretched, and they're sort of approaching levels that we saw 25 years ago in the dot-com bubble. And the second thing is that increasingly we see that data center financing is being pushed towards debt financing, right? So these things portend risks. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the bubble has to burst, and it has to burst in a very, very painful way. But if there were to be a severe correction, that could really tighten financial conditions, have serious negative wealth effects for American households, but also foreign investors. It would slow investment. It would undermine global growth. And one of the things that we have seen in past booms, is that these kind of corrections tend to be more severe and more long-lasting when they're preceded by asset booms. So, I mean, I think these are important things to keep in mind. And does that mean that countries can do nothing? Well, no. I mean, I think I'd like to highlight 4 things that we've learned that countries could do. The first, at least in the case of AI, is really to broaden adoption. Everyone's talked about this, but I think this is absolutely critical. What does it mean in practice? It means ensuring broader diffusion within the economy, closing skills gaps in those countries where needed, building up public digital infrastructure. And this is really how countries can, the US and other countries can realize the productivity dividends. So I think that's the first point. The second point is related to my point that I made on tax incentives and tax and incentive systems. I mean, we really need to make sure that our tax and incentive systems are not creating this kind of an overheating in the AI sector, right? So encouraging innovation, yes, good thing, but sort of over-fueling this AI-led development boom could be problematic. So I think really looking at these kind of incentives carefully and ensuring that they're not leading to excessive investment in AI is really important. The third point is to recognize that fiscal policy becomes very pro-cyclical when you have these kind of booms. And I think this is an important point because there's a political economy to this. Governments tend to cut taxes, or they tend to spend a lot. It pushes up debt whenever you have these kind of boom, commodity booms. So the analog to that is, well, you need to have fiscal prudence, which we're really in short supply of across the world. You need that fiscal prudence. You need those sound fiscal frameworks and institutions to temper those kind of booms. And finally, and this is really important, it's to monitor the AI build out for its macro financial implications. As things stand right now, there are no real sort of systemic financial stability risks that are totally evident. But that doesn't necessarily mean they can't materialize. And so I think it's really important for governments, central bankers, regulators to really stress test adverse scenarios. What if this thing becomes the mother of all crashes? I mean, who's going to be impacted and how? How are we going to clean this up? And for those governments that are really using public funds to build these things out, which many governments are, what are the contingent, are governments going to be left holding the bag? So what are the contingent fiscal liabilities you're building up? I think these are the four things that I would say that countries should do, and they can learn from previous booms.
Very helpful. And one last question before we go to Q&A, back to Susan. So IRA has laid out some of the questions that every country's leadership and policymakers should be asking themselves for the contingency planning. I know you've spent a lot of time with the World Bank, and I'm curious if you could talk about some of the differences between how a developing country should look at how to embrace AI versus Europe and China versus countries at the leading edge of AI technology development like the US and China.
I'm actually pretty optimistic for the impact on developing countries, partly because many of the jobs are actually not that AI exposed. Second, one of the big things holding back development is lack of digitization. And AI is actually, digitization is just very, very expensive. But actually AI makes it much easier to digitize. Like you can kind of leapfrog over all the pain that people had in the past. You can run a business off of your phone. In China, off of WeChat, you can just take all your orders for your little restaurant on the phone, and then you push a button, and now there's digital marketing going to those people who showed up at your restaurant, and coupons showing up at 11:30 before lunch, and you're just a person running a restaurant with a phone, and you only are using one app. So it's kind of, it's an app on top of WeChat, but so there's so many opportunities, I think, and so why can't firms grow? Because if they don't digitize, they can't increase their span of control. My colleague Nick Bloom here has done a lot of work on these best practices and how they're not implemented in small firms. So I think it, and then of course the government services, the whole developing world has too few teachers. Teachers who don't know the subject they're teaching, nurses who don't have an education in health. The ROI on those investments is huge. And so if I can make every nurse, more productive, that is a huge growth opportunity for those countries. So I'm actually really bullish. I think they have fewer of the downsides and more of the upsides. Now, there's a few countries that are exporting cheap labor in call centers or whatever, that doesn't look so good. Okay, but a lot of countries are actually better positioned and less prone to negatives than we are. Now they're going to be importing it though, and so that's an issue.
And just to quickly jump in, the thing that I see is that there's a breakaway. Sort of the convergence gaps tend magnify. What I mean by that is that this is such a bonus, this technology is such a bonus for advanced economies because you have the digital infrastructure, you have a lot of workers with those skills. So when we talk about augmenting work, we talked a lot in the morning sessions about, the afternoon sessions about augment the technology, how it augments workers. Well, you have workers with the digital skills to be augmented. And so in many of these emerging market and developing economies, people don't have the digital skills. You don't even have the basic digital infrastructure. So that's the challenge. You need the foundational aspects, the foundational policies in place. And in many countries, that's still lacking.
For some of the things. For other things, you just need a phone.
That's true.
So, yes, it's a different kind of technology, but actually you don't need, that's my whole reason for being excited about it. Like, it used to be just, you did need all those things to adopt the machine learning or whatever, but actually for generative AI-based things, you need nothing. You actually don't need to code. You don't need, you just
Yeah, for
need
the
to,
applications, you mean, yeah, exactly.
to consume, but, and to write them.
Yeah.
I'm very optimistic about the developing country context, just like for similar reasons why like mobile and finance had leapfrogged in places like Kenya, like AI. We already are, GPT-5, Gemini 3, they are already an AI doctor. They are better than, the diagnoses they'll give you, in my opinion, are more reliable than most doctors. We have a huge licensing and credentialing regime here. Developing countries often don't have those things. That is a doctor without borders, and this technology is going to flow and deliver enormous benefits to those communities earlier than us, I think.
So let's go to questions for the panel.
Thanks so much, John Chisholm. There hasn't been any mention today so far about the impact of AI on leisure time. What are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, there's a short run and a long run. I think one of the paradoxes of AI is that even though it could potentially massively increase our productivity, it may also make us much more busy, right? So if there's this concept of like of super productivity, you know, if we move from being 10% more productive at your job to managing teams of AIs that are doing basically the work of 50 people, you may find yourself like very little bandwidth. But then once we have the AI that can do that management, then we might just snap to having nothing much left to do. And so I've always thought that in the long run, like the long run, which may be like 15 years, that what is the end state for like a pure like full automation economy? It probably looks a lot like a Gulf state monarchy, right? They have an oil spigot. They have robots, which they call guest workers, come and build their stadiums. They do massive mega projects in the desert. And what do they do all day? They host events, right? This is I think that's going to be our leisure economy, is basically going to be living in these like rentier states with a resource curse, and then we get to go to more things like this.
I may add to that, though, just a completely different version of that is that it's amazing right now that if you have an idea and it's of a certain category, you can just make it reality. Like, and going back to the point about how easy these are. Like, I built an AI app this summer. I coded for a morning, and I mostly vibe coded. And then I had a team of non-technical undergraduates work on it for the next 2 months. And so I have an English major, a philosophy major, a linguistics major, an education major, and we built a really nice thing. Because the after like the basic structure was down, which took me a very small amount of time, then they could make it better, because they were writing text. That was their job, was to write text, and then to write text that evaluated text, and to create a simple spreadsheet of measures of how it worked. And I could, if they didn't know how to make an Excel formula, ChatGPT could show them how. So to aggregate the results. So this is something that everybody can participate in. Now, there are many problems that can't be solved in that way, but like if you have an idea right now, you can build it, and that's kind of amazing. And then if maybe it's a more complicated idea, you need a little bit more, but like it is kind of an amazing time to live. So like, why would you be bored?
There is a sense, people often say these days the most powerful programming language is English, or the speed of your fingertips. I think we're out of time, so I want you to join me in thanking this panel for speaking with us today.